The summer heat beat down on the Georgia Interstate rest stop as cars pulled in and out, their tires crunching against the sun-baked asphalt. It was just another ordinary Wednesday afternoon in June, the kind where the air shimmers above the pavement and travelers seek refuge in the air-conditioned building for a quick break from their journeys. Staff Sergeant James stepped out of his blue pickup truck, stretching his arms above his head after 4 straight hours of driving. His crisp military haircut and straight posture stood out even in his casual clothes. Old habits from 15 years of service don't fade easily. He'd made this drive between bases dozens of times before, and this rest stop was his usual halfway point. As he walked toward the building, something caught his attention. Maybe it was his training, or maybe just instinct, but something felt off about the scene unfolding near the entrance. A young black girl, probably around 12 years old, walked a few steps ahead of a white man who looked to be in his 50s. At first glance, they might have seemed like any other father and daughter, but little details started adding up in James's mind. The girl wore a wrinkled t-shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in days. Her hair was messy, and despite the scorching heat, she had on a long-sleeve jacket. The man behind her wore expensive clothes, designer shoes that James recognized from the mall displays, and a watch that probably cost more than his monthly salary. The contrast was striking. But it wasn't just their appearance that bothered James. It was the way they moved. The man kept one hand firmly on the girl's shoulder, steering her through the parking lot like a puppet. They didn't talk to each other. No laughing, no casual conversation, none of the normal back and forth you'd expect between a father and daughter. The girl's eye stayed fixed on the ground, her shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make herself smaller. James slowed his pace, pretending to check his phone while keeping them in his peripheral vision. He'd seen enough troubling situations during his deployments to know when something wasn't right. The rest stop was busy, filled with families on summer vacation, truck drivers taking mandatory breaks, and elderly couples walking their dogs. Nobody else seemed to notice anything unusual about the pair. As they got closer to the building, James positioned himself near the water fountain, taking a long drink while observing their reflection in the glass doors. The man's eyes darted around constantly, scanning the crowd in a way that reminded James of his combat training, always looking for threats, always planning escape routes. The girl lifted her head slightly as they passed him, and for just a moment their eyes met in the reflection. The look in her eyes made James's military training kick into high gear. It wasn't just fear he saw, it was a silent plea for help. Through the glass doors, James watched as they headed toward the restroom area. He noticed how the man positioned himself between the girl and the exit, how his grip tightened when other people walked too close. These weren't the actions of a protective father. They were the calculated moves of someone with something to hide. James pulled out his phone again, this time opening his messages. His training had taught him that rushing into situations without backup could make things worse. He needed to be smart about this. As he typed a quick message to the rest stop security number posted on the wall, he kept one eye on the pair through the glass. Other travelers streamed past him. A mom wrangling 3 kids, an elderly couple sharing a bag of chips, a group of college students laughing about something on their phones. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware of the drama unfolding right in front of them. But James noticed everything. He noticed how the girl's hands trembled slightly at her sides. He noticed how the man's jaw clenched whenever someone walked too close. He noticed the way the girl kept trying to make eye contact with other travelers, only to quickly look away when the man squeezed her shoulder. The heat from the parking lot radiated through the glass doors, but James felt a chill run down his spine. In his years of service, he'd learned to trust his gut, and right now, his gut was screaming that something was very, very wrong. As he waited for a response to his message, he started forming a plan. Whatever was going on here, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Not when a child might be in danger. The afternoon sun continued to beat down outside, and the rest stop carried on with its usual busy rhythm. But in that moment, standing by the water fountain with his phone in his hand, James knew that this ordinary Wednesday was about to become anything but ordinary. Inside the rest stop building, the air conditioning hummed steadily, a sharp contrast to the heavy summer heat outside. The young girl walked through the crowded space, her steps careful and measured, like someone trying to cross a frozen lake without breaking the ice. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail, every face, searching for someone who might notice that something wasn't right. She remembered the video she'd watched just 3 weeks ago during lunch break at school. Her teacher had shown the class a social media clip about safety signals, including the universal SOS sign. At the time, it had seemed like just another boring safety lesson, the kind that adults were always trying to teach kids. Now, those few minutes of watching that video felt like the most important moment of her life. The man's hand remained firmly on her shoulder, his fingers digging in slightly whenever she slowed down or moved in a way he didn't like. He steered her through the crowd like a remote-controlled car, avoiding the busiest areas and keeping close to the walls. His expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the smell of cigarettes and coffee on his breath as he leaned down to whisper harsh reminders about behaving and staying quiet. Her heart pounded so hard she worried everyone could hear it, but nobody seemed to notice anything wrong. Families walked past, focused on their own children and travel plans. Truck drivers headed straight for the coffee counter, barely glancing around. An elderly couple argued about which route to take to Florida. Everyone was wrapped up in their own little worlds, blind to her silent panic. Then she spotted him, the military man from outside. He stood near the vending machines, his posture straight but casual, pretending to choose a snack while his alert eyes scanned the room. She'd grown up in a military town, had seen that same alertness in her uncle who served overseas. Something about the way he watched everything without seeming to stare gave her hope. The man's grip on her shoulder loosened slightly as he checked his phone. It was her chance. With trembling fingers, she let her right hand drop to her side, slightly behind her hip where the man couldn't see it. Slowly, deliberately, she began to form the letters she'd learned from that video, SOS, SOS. Her fingers shook as she repeated the pattern, praying someone would notice. The military man was still there, now pretending to read the nutrition label on a bag of chips. But she could tell he was watching. His eyes flickered to her hand for just a split second, and she saw something change in his expression. He'd noticed. Her heart leaped, but she kept her face down, knowing she couldn't show any reaction. The man holding her was too experienced, too careful. One wrong move, and he'd rush her out of there. More people filtered through the building. A group of teenagers laughing at something on their phones, a mom trying to corral twin toddlers, a bus driver on his break. The noise of conversations, footsteps, and humming vending machines filled the air. But to her, everything felt muffled, like she was underwater. All she could focus on was continuing that silent signal, SOS, SOS. The military man moved casually toward the coffee station, positioning himself where he could see both them and the main entrance. She noticed how he kept one hand in his pocket, probably holding his phone. Was he calling for help? Her fingers continued their desperate message, even as her arms started to ache from the awkward position. Time seemed to stretch like warm taffy. Each second felt like an hour as she waited, hoping, praying that someone would understand what was happening. The man's phone buzzed again, and his grip tightened. "Time to go," he muttered, trying to turn her toward the exit. Her heart dropped. They couldn't leave now, not when she'd finally found someone who might help. But the military man wasn't gone. Through the crowd, she could see him speaking quietly to a security guard, his gestures calm, but his eyes never leaving her and the man. Other people might have missed it, but she saw the security guard press something on his radio, saw him nod seriously at whatever the military man was saying. The man's phone buzzed again, and this time she felt his whole body tense. His fingers dug into her shoulder hard enough to hurt, but she barely noticed the pain. She was too focused on keeping her hand steady, continuing that vital signal, SOS, SOS. Whatever happened next, she couldn't stop. That video had taught her that persistence could make the difference between rescue and disaster. Through the glass doors, she caught a glimpse of red and blue lights reflecting off the parked cars. The man saw them too. She felt him freeze for just a second. In that moment, as her fingers formed those letters one more time, she realized that her silent cry for help hadn't just been noticed, it had been answered. Staff Sergeant James stood by the coffee station, stirring his untouched drink with mechanical precision, while his mind worked through the situation like a well-oiled machine. 15 years in the Marines had taught him to notice things others might miss, to see patterns in chaos, and right now, every instinct he developed in those years was telling him something was seriously wrong. He watched the pair through the reflection in the coffee machine's chrome surface. The man's expensive watch caught the fluorescent lighting, a Rolex, probably worth more than most people's monthly salary. The shine of his leather shoes and the cut of his suit screamed money, but there was something off about how he wore them. Like someone playing dress-up, trying too hard to look wealthy and respectable. The girl's clothes told a different story. Her sneakers were worn down at the edges, the kind of wear that comes from miles of walking. The long-sleeve shirt she wore despite the Georgia heat had a small tear near the elbow that had been inexpertly stitched. Her hair hadn't seen a brush in days, and even from this distance, James could tell she was wearing the same clothes she'd slept in. As he pretended to add sugar to his coffee, James's mind flashed back to his training sessions about human trafficking. The warning signs lined up like bullets on a target. The age gap, the mismatched appearances, the controlling behavior, the way they avoided security cameras. But it was more than just a checklist. It was the girl's eyes. In his time overseas, he'd seen that same look in the eyes of civilians trapped in war zones. That mixture of fear and desperate hope. More concerning was the man's body language. James recognized the signs of someone with military or law enforcement background, the way he continuously scanned exits, how he positioned himself with clear sightlines to all approaches, the supple shift in stance when uniformed personnel walked past. This wasn't some amateur. This was someone who knew what he was doing. The rest stop hummed with activity around them. A janitor pushed his cart past, nodding hello. The coffee machine gurgled as it brewed a fresh pot. A child dropped her ice cream cone and started crying. Normal life continued, but James felt like he was watching two different movies playing at once, the everyday scene most people saw, and the dangerous situation unfolding beneath the surface. He pulled out his phone again, this time opening his notes app. Years of writing mission reports had taught him to document everything. Time, 2:47 p.m. Location, rest stop mile marker 158. Subject, male, approximately 50 to 55 years old, 6'0", 200 pounds, expensive but ill-fitting clothes. Minor, female, African American, estimated age 11 to 13, signs of distress and possible travel fatigue. The girl's SOS signal continued, hidden from her captor, but clear as day to James in the chrome reflection. Her fingers must have been getting tired, but she kept going. That kind of determination, that presence of mind in a crisis, it reminded him of some of the best soldiers he'd served with. He noticed how the man's phone kept buzzing. Each time it did, the man's jaw would clench and his grip on the girl would tighten. Someone was trying to reach him, someone he didn't want to talk to. Another red flag to add to the growing list. The security guard James had alerted was doing his job perfectly, patrolling normally, but positioning himself closer to the exits. Through the windows, James could see state trooper vehicles pulling into the far end of the parking lot, lights off, taking positions without drawing attention. The net was closing, but this was the most dangerous moment. James had seen enough cornered suspects to know what could happen. The man's expensive shoes were shifting restlessly on the floor, his eyes darting more frequently to the exits. He was starting to sense something was wrong. One wrong move now could turn this into a crisis. A family with 3 kids walked between James and the pair, temporarily blocking his view. His heart rate picked up. In combat, losing sight of a target often meant trouble, but when the family passed, the man and girl were still there. The girl's fingers kept moving. SOS, SOS. The man's phone buzzed again. James took a small sip of his now-cold coffee, keeping his movements casual. He'd been in enough high-stakes situations to know that patience was crucial. The pieces were in place. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for the right moment to spring it. Through the glass doors, he caught the reflection of another state trooper's car pulling up. Perfect timing. Shift change at the rest stop meant more people coming and going, more cover for law enforcement to move into position. James set his coffee cup down and reached for his phone one more time. The next few minutes would determine everything. The afternoon sun slanted through the rest stop windows, creating long shadows across the floor as Staff Sergeant James put his military training into action. He knew that rushing in like an action movie hero would only put the girl in more danger. Instead, he moved with careful precision, each step part of a larger plan. His phone buzzed silently in his pocket, a message from the rest stop security confirming that state troopers were in position. James kept his face neutral as he read it, just another traveler checking his messages. The man holding the girl was too experienced to miss any sudden movements or worried expressions. Around them, the rest stop continued its normal rhythm. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the aroma of cinnamon rolls from the small bakery counter. A truck driver bought a sandwich from the vending machine. Two elderly women asked a janitor for directions to the restroom. James used the everyday activity as cover, drifting closer to the exit while pretending to look at travel brochures. He thought about his own daughter back home, about how many times she'd walked through public places just like this, never knowing what dangers might be lurking. The thought strengthened his resolve. This had to be handled perfectly, no room for mistakes. The security guard, following James's suggestion, started his routine patrol pattern. But this time he moved with purpose, positioning other guards at key points throughout the building. To most people, it looked like normal security work. To James's trained eye, it was like watching a chess game, pieces moving into position for checkmate. Through the windows, he could see more state trooper vehicles arriving, parking casually among the other cars, trying not to draw attention. The officers inside were probably gearing up, checking their equipment, radioing positions. James had worked with law enforcement enough times to know their protocols. The man's phone buzzed again, the fourth time in 10 minutes. James noticed how his fingers tightened on the girl's shoulder, how his other hand kept touching his jacket pocket. Years of combat experience had taught James to read these small signs. The man was getting nervous, starting to feel trapped. A family with small children walked past, and James used their movement as cover to snap a quick photo of the man's car through the window. The license plate was partially covered with dirt, not an accident, he was sure. He sent the photo to the security team, adding another piece to the puzzle they were building. The girl's fingers were still moving, forming that vital SOS signal, though James could see her hand trembling with fatigue. Her determination made his heart ache. How long had she been waiting for someone to notice? How many people had walked past without seeing her silent cry for help? At the security desk, the guard radioed something to his team, his voice calm and professional. To anyone else, it sounded like routine chatter. But James caught the code words they'd agreed on. The trap was almost ready. State troopers were in position at every exit. Local police had set up a perimeter around the rest stop. They just needed the right moment to move in. The air conditioning hummed steadily overhead as James watched the man check his phone again. The message must have been urgent because the man's face changed, just for a second, but long enough for James to see the flash of panic in his eyes. That's when James knew they couldn't wait much longer. The man was going to try to run. Using his military training, James started moving again, this time positioning himself near the man's car. He pulled out his phone, pretending to take a call while he scanned the vehicle. Tinted windows, new tires, a small dent in the rear bumper carefully painted over. All details that might help identify the car if things went wrong. The rest stop's regular noise, conversations, footsteps, the beeping of vending machines, seemed to fade into the background as James focused on his task. He'd been in enough combat situations to recognize this feeling, the calm before the storm. Everything looked normal on the surface, but tension was building underneath. The security guard made another pass, this time closer to the man and girl. James watched as the man's body tensed, saw him glance at the exits. The girl's SOS signal never stopped, even though her hand must have been cramping by now. They were running out of time. James sent one final message to the security team. The next few minutes would determine everything. As he watched the guard approach for what would be the final time, he silently thanked all his years of training. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with patience, planning, and perfect timing. Time seemed to slow down as the security guard approached the man and girl, his footsteps echoing off the rest stop's tile floor. He moved with practiced casualness, just another uniform doing his job, but his eyes told a different story. The guard had positioned himself perfectly, between the man and the nearest exit, close enough to act, but not so close as to spook him. "Afternoon, folks," the guard said, his voice friendly but firm. "Just doing routine checks. Mind if I see some ID?" The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he waited for a response, his hand resting casually near his radio. The man's reaction was instant but subtle, a tightening of his jaw, a slight shift in his stance that only someone with military training like Staff Sergeant James would notice. The grip on the girl's shoulder became visibly tighter, his knuckles turning white against the dark fabric of her shirt. "Is there a problem?" the man asked, his voice steady but with an edge that sent warning signals through James's mind. The rest stop's normal bustle continued around them, the click of shoes on tile, the beep of vending machines, the murmur of conversations, but James could feel the tension building like a thunderstorm. The security guard maintained his professional smile. "No problem at all, sir. Just following new state guidelines for child safety. You understand, with all the recent concerns about trafficking." He left the sentence hanging, watching the man's reaction. That's when everything happened at once. The man's phone buzzed again, and this time when he glanced at it, his face went pale. In that split second of distraction, the girl saw her chance. She'd been watching the military man, had sensed him moving closer, and knew this was her moment. With a burst of strength that surprised everyone, she twisted away from the man's grip. Her movement was so sudden that his fingers slipped from her shoulder. Time seemed to snap back to normal speed as she darted through the crowd, heading straight for Staff Sergeant James. The man lunged after her, but the security guard was ready. He stepped forward, not grabbing the man but simply placing himself in the way. "Sir, please stay where you are," the guard said, his voice now carrying the full weight of authority. James knelt down as the girl reached him, putting himself between her and the man. His combat training kicked in automatically. Assess, protect, communicate. The girl was shaking but standing strong, her eyes clear and determined despite her fear. The man's face transformed, the mask of respectability falling away. He took one step toward them, then froze as he realized what was happening. Through the rest stop windows, police lights suddenly flashed to life in the parking lot. The state troopers who had been waiting out of sight began moving in, their vehicles blocking all possible escape routes. The rest stop's other visitors began to notice something was wrong. A small crowd gathered, phones appearing in hands, but the security team quickly moved to control the situation. "Nothing to see here, folks. Please continue with your day," another guard announced, directing people away from the scene. The man looked around wildly, like a caged animal searching for escape. But James could see the moment he realized it was over. Every exit was covered. Police officers were already entering the building. The carefully planned trap had sprung perfectly. "You're safe now," James said quietly to the girl, who was still standing beside him, her hands finally still after maintaining that SOS signal for so long. She nodded, and for the first time since he'd spotted her in the parking lot, her shoulders relaxed slightly. The state troopers moved in with professional efficiency, their movements careful and controlled. They didn't rush, didn't shout, they didn't need to. The man's shoulders slumped as he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. The truth started coming out in pieces, like a puzzle slowly being put together. In a quiet room at the local police station, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs, the young girl sat wrapped in a blanket someone had given her. A child advocacy worker sat nearby, her voice gentle as she helped the girl tell her story. 3 days earlier, on a quiet morning in South Carolina, the girl had been walking to her school bus stop. It was a route she'd taken hundreds of times before, past the corner store where the owner always waved hello, past the house with the friendly golden retriever who watched from the window. But that morning was different. The expensive car had pulled up slowly, its engine barely making a sound. The man inside had called out, claiming to be a friend of her mother's, saying there was a family emergency. He knew her mother's name, knew where she worked, details that made his story seem real. In those few seconds of confusion and fear, he'd managed to get her into the car. As the girl spoke, investigators were already piecing together more of the story. The man's fingerprints revealed his true identity. He wasn't just some random criminal. He had a history, a pattern that stretched across 3 states. Bank records showed large transfers, connections to people who were already under investigation. Staff Sergeant James sat in another room, giving his statement to the state police. He described everything he'd noticed. The man's expensive clothes that didn't quite fit right, the girl's unwashed appearance, the way they moved through the crowd. Every detail he'd observed through his military training was now helping build a stronger case. The rest stop's security cameras had caught everything. The footage showed the girl's subtle SOS signal, played out over and over in those tense minutes. The security guard's careful approach, the coordinated response of law enforcement, it all looked like a perfectly choreographed dance when viewed through the camera's unblinking eye. Back at the girl's home in South Carolina, her family had been living through a nightmare. 3 days of desperate searching, of putting up posters, of jumping every time the phone rang. When the call finally came from Georgia law enforcement, her mother had collapsed into tears of relief. Now she was on her way, driving through the afternoon traffic with a police escort, counting the minutes until she could hold her daughter again. The investigation expanded quickly. The man's phone, which he'd been checking so nervously at the rest stop, contained messages from others involved in his crimes. Each piece of evidence revealed more connections, more potential victims who might need help. Law enforcement agencies from multiple states were now working together, sharing information, building a bigger picture. In the police station's break room, one of the officers showed James a social media post from 3 weeks ago, the same safety video the girl had watched in school. It had been part of a new program teaching kids about personal safety and awareness. The officer shook his head in amazement. "That video saved her life," he said quietly. "That and your training." The girl's statement revealed more details about the past 3 days. She talked about being moved from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to raise suspicion. She described how she'd kept track of road signs, trying to remember details like her teachers had taught her. Even in her fear, she'd stayed alert, waiting for a chance to signal for help. As evening approached, more pieces fell into place. The man's car, now impounded, contained evidence that would help with other ongoing investigations. His phone records showed a pattern of movement that matched other reported attempts in different cities. What had started as one rescue was expanding into something much bigger. The child advocacy worker brought the girl some food, a sandwich and some hot chocolate. As she ate, some color returned to her cheeks. She was tired, but stronger than anyone might have expected. When asked how she'd remembered the SOS signal for so long, she simply said, "I knew if I kept trying, someone would understand." In another part of the building, federal agents were already arriving. The case was growing beyond state lines, revealing connections to larger trafficking networks. The man's arrest wasn't just about saving one girl, it was about uncovering and stopping a much bigger operation. As the sun began to set outside the police station windows, casting long shadows across the parking lot, the girl's mother finally arrived. The reunion happened in a private room, away from prying eyes. The sound of their tearful embrace carried through the closed door, touching the hearts of even the most seasoned officers. James stayed until he was sure everything was under control. As he finally headed back to his car to continue his journey, he thought about how many things had come together to make this rescue possible: the safety video at the girl's school, his military training, the quick response of law enforcement, and most importantly, the courage of a young girl who refused to give up hope. The story of what happened at that Georgia rest stop didn't end with the arrest or even with the emotional family reunion. Like ripples in a pond, its effects spread outward, touching lives and changing things in ways nobody could have predicted. In the weeks that followed, the man faced justice in a courtroom where the evidence against him was overwhelming. His arrest had opened doors that law enforcement had been trying to break through for months. The carefully documented observations of a Marine, the quick thinking of a young girl, and the coordinated response of multiple agencies had created a chain of evidence that couldn't be broken. The girl returned to her normal life, but she wasn't the same person who had walked to that bus stop on that fateful morning. She was stronger now, more confident. With support from counselors and her family, she began speaking at school assemblies, sharing her story to help other kids stay safe. The video that had taught her the SOS signal became part of standard safety training in schools across the country. Staff Sergeant James went back to his base, returning to his regular duties, but the story followed him. His commanding officer recommended him for a commendation, not just for the rescue itself, but for how he'd handled it, the patience, the planning, the perfect balance of action and restraint. His example became a teaching point in military training sessions about how combat experience could be applied to civilian situations. The rest stop installed better security cameras and improved lighting in their parking lots. Other highway stops across the state followed suit. The security guard who had played such a crucial role in the rescue helped develop new training procedures for rest stop employees, teaching them what signs to watch for and how to respond. 1 year later, the girl stood on her school's auditorium stage, now a poised young teenager. She was receiving an award for her work in promoting child safety awareness. The audience included not just her proud family, but also Staff Sergeant James, the security guard, and several of the law enforcement officers who had been there that day. After the ceremony, people gathered in small groups, sharing updates and memories. The security guard had been promoted to head of regional safety training. Several of the officers talked about how the case had led to other rescues, other children brought home safely. The ripples were still spreading. The girl's mother had started a support group for families of missing children, turning her own nightmare experience into a way to help others. She worked closely with law enforcement now, helping them understand what families went through, how to better communicate with parents living through their worst fears. Social media picked up the story again when a popular news show did a special report. It focused not just on the dramatic rescue, but on the bigger picture, how one person's awareness could make a difference, how a simple safety video could save a life, how strangers could come together in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment. The state police used the case to improve their response protocols. They created new guidelines for handling similar situations, emphasizing the importance of calm, coordinated action. The Rest Stop Rescue became a case study in police academies, teaching future officers about the value of patience and careful observation. 2 years after that day at the rest stop, the girl walked across another stage, this time at her high school graduation. In the audience, Staff Sergeant James sat with her family, an honored guest at her special request. She had written her college application essay about that day, about how it had shaped her decision to study criminal justice and child psychology. The impact continued to ripple outward. Other young people who heard the story came forward with their own experiences, leading to more arrests, more children saved. Parents became more aware, communities more vigilant. The simple SOS hand signal went viral on social media, taught in schools, shared in community centers, demonstrated in police outreach programs. Schools across the country started implementing more comprehensive safety programs. They didn't just teach children about stranger danger anymore. They taught them about awareness, about trusting their instincts, about the power of simple signals, and the importance of never giving up hope. The men's arrest led to the discovery and shutdown of a larger trafficking network. Every piece of evidence, every connection uncovered, helped law enforcement protect more children. The ripples kept spreading, touching more lives, preventing more crimes before they could happen. On quiet afternoons, Staff Sergeant James would sometimes think back to that day at the rest stop. He'd remember the girl's determined fingers spelling out SOS over and over, the security guard's careful approach, the perfect coordination of the response team. It reminded him that sometimes the biggest victories come from the smallest moments of awareness, from people simply paying attention and choosing to act. The story became more than just a successful rescue. It became a reminder that in a world that can sometimes seem dark and frightening, there are always people watching, people caring, people ready to help. It showed that sometimes the simplest things, a hand signal, a moment of attention, a decision to trust your instincts, can change not just one life, but many.